There is something about that name. Amen. Good evening. Hope you guys had a good day today. Felt like we got a lot of complainers here tonight. Oh, okay. Okay. I don't know if I can preach to this crowd. We're in 1 Samuel chapter 27 tonight. Another one of those interesting chapters. You've probably noticed by now that there's, seems like with every chapter there's some kind of a twist and turn, and this one is no different. So let's begin here. Verse number 1. Sorry, I think I'm overriding you. I've got it. But David thought to himself, I should underline, thought to himself, one of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul. The best thing I can do is to escape to the land of the Philistines. What do you think about that? Think David's in for more trouble? We get in trouble usually when we think to ourselves. He didn't say he sought the Lord. He said, I thought to myself, or he thought to himself. And here's what he thought. If I keep going like I'm going now, Saul is going to catch me and kill me. But the problem with that is the Lord has promised him that he would sit on the throne. Amen. And besides that, he was told by his wife, Abigail, as well as his friend Jonathan, they all declared that you will be king of Israel. Even Saul himself said that, did he not? So here David is thinking to himself that he needs to make a move. God's not keeping up with things, so he needs to make a move. And the best thing he can do is escape to the land of Philistines. Then Saul will give up searching for me, he says, anywhere in Israel, and I will slip out of his hand. So David and the 600 men with him left and went over to Achish, son of Maoch, king of Gath. And David and his men settled in Gath with Achish. Gath, of course, is Philistine country. We can understand, I think, where David was at. He's been hunted. He's a fugitive. He's literally having to run and hide for his life. He's having to scrape around, try to find food for 2,000 people, 600 men, then they had their wives and families. And so it wasn't an easy task. And about the time he found a good hiding spot, it seems like someone would rat him out, and Saul would come calling, and he would have to do it all over again. So there's no doubt that was frustrating. There's no doubt that given any one of us given that same situation might be guilty of the same thing. You get weary, amen? Anybody here ever get weary? Sometimes you just get weary, and usually when that happens, if you don't pull away and spend some time with the Lord, you end up making bad decisions. I've been there, and I'm sure many of us have before. So he's running and hiding, and this strain of being on the run is, I think, taking its toll on David, because here he seems to doubt God's promises or to forget his promises altogether. Instead, he lets fear and belief take over his life. And so when that happens, when we get our eyes on circumstances, we usually say, I need to do something, right? And that's when we should fall on our knees and say, God, you need to do something. Lord, would you please take care of this? So David came to two desperate conclusions in these verses. Number one, that Saul's relentless pursuit would succeed. Eventually, he said, Saul's going to kill me. So he came to that decision, that conclusion on his own, even though God has protected him every step of the way thus far, right? And even though God has promised, you're going to sit on the throne. You're my chosen one. So he came to that decision. Secondly, he came to the decision that he must flee for his life. Flee the promised land and live with the enemy. There's nothing about that that makes good sense, if you're thinking right, you know. They've been fighting the Philistines all this time. They're Israel's worst enemy, at least during this period of time. And so, but he makes this decision, I need to leave Israel. I need to leave the promised land, which is a big decision for him to make. And but he does make it, and we might think that seems impossible under the circumstances, but if we keep in mind God's promises, as I said to David, and the many times that he confirmed those promises or that promise to him. But there's no doubt that pressure and circumstances can mess up our thinking. Would you agree with that? If you get under enough pressure and if your circumstances are negative enough, if we're not careful, we can get under those circumstances. And that's usually when we make decisions that aren't born of prayer and born of the Spirit. Can lead us to doubt, can lead us to take our lives into our own hands. Some hardship, some perplexing trial. I'll be the first to confess that I've been there. I have been in circumstances where I became discouraged as a pastor, and I made decisions about the church that were not the best decisions to make. At one point, I almost left our church in Houston for no good reason, just because I was a little despondent about whatever it was going on at that time. But the one thing that kept me from doing that is I have always believed, my conviction, this is not for any other preacher, my conviction is that God knows where I live. And if I had sent out resumes like I was encouraged to do, I might have made that bad decision. But I've always believed that, God knows where I'm at, and if He wants me, He can call me, He can move me, and He's done a pretty good job of that. Amen. So, what stories in the Bible can you think of that illustrate this situation David's in, getting under the circumstances or getting his eyes on the circumstances and making bad decisions? Think of any Bible stories that illustrate that? Yeah, Jonah. Yeah, wow, that's a good one. Jonah was just, huh? Peter, absolutely. Jonah I think he was backslidden from the get-go. But yeah, Peter is a good one. Peter, remember Peter called out the Lord, Lord, if that's you, let me come to you. And Jesus said, come. And so he bailed out of the boat and started walking on the water, but then he looked around. He looked around, he saw the wind and the storm and the waves, and he began to doubt. And he's saying, what a great illustration of how circumstances or getting under our circumstances can really lead us in the wrong direction. Each man had his family with him. David has two wives, Ahinoam and Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel. Here's the verse I wanted to look at, Hebrews chapter 3. This is an encouragement to us. See to it, brothers and sisters, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God, but encourage one another daily, as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. That's a great encouragement, amen? When we see a brother or sister down, when we understand that they're going through a difficult circumstance, that's a great time for us to come alongside and just encourage them and to pray with them and encourage them to just keep trusting the Lord. Sometimes, at least the way I describe it, sometimes as you're going through trials, you just got to hang on till the Lord decides to take care of it. Amen? Sometimes he lets us go through the storm, but we don't need to make decisions to bail out then. We just need to hang on. And then 1 Samuel chapter 27, verse 4, when Saul was told that David had fled to Gath, he no longer searched for him. So what David thought was true, that if he gets out of Israel, Saul's no longer going to pursue him. But does that justify making a decision that he made? I don't think so. I think, again, he's trusting himself. He thinks he has to take his life in his own hands. In verse 5, then David said to Achish, if I have found favor in your eyes, this is the king Achish, if I found favor in your eyes, let a place be assigned to me in one of the country towns, that I may live there. When he first moves into Gath, he's living in Gath, he and his 2,000 cohorts. So he goes to the king and he says, look, if it's okay with you, if I found favor in your eyes, let me and my people go to one of the country towns. And he says, so on that day, Achish gave him Ziklag, and it has belonged to the kings of Judah ever since. David lived in Philistine territory for a year and 4 months. Ziklag is interesting, and I think there are a couple things interesting about this. David moves into Gath. When you think about it, an influx of 2,000 people in a city that's not that large, it can take a drain on the city's, not their finances, but their ability to take care of people, right? I mean, it's kind of what we have with the open border. You know, our hospitals are flooded, our schools are flooded, and so I think that's why David, one of the reasons, it's not the only reason, one of the reasons that David said, why don't you just give us one of these country towns? I think the other reason is because he didn't want to be under King Achish's thumb. He wanted to have a little bit of room to roam, as we'll see out there. Verse number 8, now David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. From ancient times, these people had lived in the land extending to Shur of Egypt. Let me go back to Ziklag for a moment, where he asked, where the king actually let David and his men go. It's a country town. It was promised to the tribes of Simeon and Judah under Joshua, but they've never possessed this land up to this point because Israel wasn't willing to do the fighting. They weren't willing to go in and rid the Canaanites and whatnot of it. And so it's never belonged to him. But David moves there and he begins to conquer more of the promised land. We'll talk about that. So it was isolated away from King Achish, and so David was able to go out on these raiding parties, and he went to territory that belonged to the Canaanites, and he was winning back territory that belonged to Israel. Does that make sense? It had already been given to Israel. They had just never claimed it, so David's claiming it. Very wise to do that, because one of these days he's going to be king, and he's going to need that extra territory and those extra people. But here, again, he lied, right? Because when he tells the king, when he goes back after plundering, he gives much of the plunder to the king. And what does he tell the king? He says, I have been raiding towns in Israel. That's not where he was it? So the king's happy with that because he thinks, well, if David's fighting Israel, they'll never want him back again. In fact, let me read it. When David attacked an area, he did not leave a man or woman alive, but took sheep and cattle and donkeys and camels and clothes. Then he returned to Achish. Verse 10, when Achish asked, where did you go raiding today? David would say, against the Negev of Judah, or against the Negev of Jerahmeel, or against the Negev of the Kenites. He did not leave a man or woman alive to be brought to Gath, for he thought they might inform on us and say, this is what David did, and such was his practice as long as he lived in Philistine territory. So he's out reclaiming Israel, the land that should belong to Israel, but actually it's under the control of the Philistines. And but he didn't tell him that. And so in order to keep someone from coming and telling the king what David was doing, he had a policy of extermination. Just kill them all. And that's what the Lord did many times when they went in to take over an enemy territory. So verse 12 says, Achish trusted David and said to himself, he has become so obnoxious to his people, the Israelites, that he will be my servant for life. So I don't have to worry about this guy leaving. He can't go home. So he's going to be my bodyguard, my servant from here on out. Romans, let me come back to that. So David is lying to the king. He lied to himself and convinced himself that he should run away from Israel and go and live in this foreign land. And so he's got himself in a predicament. However, he stays there, the Bible said, for a year and I think 2 months. I forget exactly what it was when we read it. 4 months, I believe a year and 4 months. And then he went back into it. It comes back to the question we talked about the other day. Is it okay to lie? And we talked about the one circumstance where a life was at stake. But in this circumstance, do you think it was justified for David to lie to the king and even lie to himself? Well, whether or not it's justified, it didn't serve his purpose, right? It didn't do him any good. It took him further away from the Lord instead of closer to him. And so I think the lesson for us is lying or deceiving people always creates problems. Would you agree with that? Romans 1:8 says, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. This is so serious that God gave some of his strictest condemnation to this issue of deceitfulness or lying. If a man lies to his wife, what happens? Or vice versa, if she lies to him. It creates distrust in the marriage, does it not? And so now we have a couple who did love one another. Maybe they still do, but they don't trust one another. And I can't tell you how many times I've counseled with couples after they had split or whatever the case may be. And usually it was the man who would say, well, okay, I apologize, but she still is not the same. She hasn't forgiven me. I said, no, buddy, you got to earn your trust, right? You can't just say I'm sorry and expect everything to be okay. When you do something like that, you have to re-earn that person's trust. And that's not always easy for us men to understand, right? When an employer deceives employees, it creates a bad environment at work. Sometimes it ends up with employees leaving. Sometimes it actually takes companies down. And then when nations lie to other nations, well, today that's standard procedure, is it not? I don't think China has ever told the truth about one thing. I think they're just, huh? Well, but it's modus operandi for nations. Same thing with Russia. Same thing with all of them. They don't speak. Even the United States is not always truthful with their allies and with other nations. And of course, when that happens, it creates distrust. And when people distrust you, then it makes a tough relationship. I read where one of the Russian officials, I forget his title, but he said this week, he said that America is trying to destroy Russia. Well, that's not true. We're trying to get Russia to stop destroying the people in Ukraine. But he's passing that lie. He's trying to convince people that America's the bad person, just like China. When the balloon Don't you love all the memes that's coming on Facebook about the balloons? I love it. I saw one had some balloons, on a chair, and the caption was, balloon rides canceled until further notice. And Marty's put some real good ones on. I can't remember, but so even though there are times when we may not tell the truth, the solution is get it right. Amen. The solution is, especially in these circumstances that we've talked about. Romans 8:29 says, they have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, but they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. They know the truth, but they choose not to do the truth. And then here's another in Proverbs 12:22, the Lord detests what? Lying lips. There's another verse that says there's 6 things the Lord hates, yea, 7 are an abomination to him, and one of them is lying there. The Lord detests lying lips, but he delights in people who are trustworthy. In Psalms 19:5, a false witness will not go unpunished, and whoever pours out lies will not go free. The problem with not telling the truth is you've got to worry every day, right? You got to worry, is that going to be found out? Is this thing going to come home to roost? And usually it does. Sooner or later, it usually comes home to roost. And so the bottom line is it's not worth it. But I think the real lesson here is David getting his eyes on circumstances and then feeling like that he had to do something. Instead of trusting the Lord, he had to do something for himself and deliver himself. And of course, he did that, and it doesn't turn out real great for him. Any questions or comments? Clear as mud. Yes, sir.
Mark Twain said that the difference between an honest man and a liar is that a liar has to have a better memory.
That's true. Yeah, I've heard that. That's very true. So you got to remember what you said, and it's impossible if you're a continual liar. Good point. Anything else? Let's go to the Lord in prayer then. Father, thank you for our time together tonight.